Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulent change that I've stopped listing them. This is Andy Revkin coming to you from down East Maine. And I try hard on this show called Sustain What to take us through conversations that can help to clarify paths to a more resilient, more sustainable future. Amid all the change and with hazards that we face around the world, uh, one of which has repeatedly rocked the Himalayas in recent years. It's basically having a lot of water stored up there and a lot of young rock. The Himalayan mountain range is newborn, basically by geological standards. And now with climate change, you're creating a recipe for calamity. And of course, calamity only happens if there are people in the way. And the Himalayan Front Range is also incredibly populous. And you're seeing anywhere you've been seeing headlines showing just how profound this latest disaster is. The images from that Tibet Nepal border checkpoint and others are just stunning. And of course, now is the cleanup and rescue. The body count will continue to rise, of course, and I'm just showing you one of many live streams on Indian and Nepali TV. And I'm really lucky and honored to have two guests who dug deep on this kind of issue. Sorry about the digging, used the digging word. Dan Shugar, who is at University of Calgary, but has spent a big chunk of his career in geomorphology, looking at kind of the interface of climate and geology and human vulnerability in these very areas. He did an epic paper on a show on another catastrophe where two dams were badly damaged. A couple hundred people were killed, most working on those dams in 2021. He did the science. He was the lead author on a 43 author science paper deconstructing that one. And Ramesh Bhushal, who's a Nepal-based journalist I've gotten to know over the last 8 years, maybe, who's doing great work on this. You'll hear about his book. And he had been flagging this kind of threat in his reporting for a long time. So with that in mind, I thought we'd just dive right in. Dan, we'll start with the sort of the geological and climate context and you. Could you just describe briefly your background, and what's led you to this particular focal point in your work, and then we'll read into
Sure.
what happened here.
So, in case anybody doesn't know what a geomorphologist is, it's essentially a geoscientist that is interested in how land forms and landscapes evolve. And so my particular interest, what gets me scientifically curious is fairly rapid changes in mountain environments, often where glaciers and climate change sort of intersect. Quite often, those processes end up in hazards, or when they impact people, like this horrific tragedy. We call them disasters. And so my first sort of foray into this kind of work, at least on the disaster side, was just over a decade ago following the Gorka earthquake, and saw how I could take what up to that point I had thought was just a scientific skill set that didn't really have a whole lot of use outside of the university, but could turn that into something that would that could help in a disaster setting.
Right. That interface of scientific knowledge and policy and behavior is a really tough place, because there are these competing realities that people in politics have to deal with, growth, and people tend to, all around the world, there's this phenomenon that two geographers I've written about a lot, Steve Strader and Walker Ashley, describe what they call the expanding bullseye of human development in fire zones, flood zones, rockslide zones, earthquake zones, and the Himalayas are really kind of a prime example. Maybe Ramesh, you can talk about briefly your background. As a journalist, you could focus on anything. So, what pulled you into this particular arena? And thanks for your time again from late at night there in Kathmandu.
Thank you, Andy. I became a journalist by accident. I was not meant to be a journalist. I was studying environmental science in university back in 2005 when this climate change thing was coming up as a big issue in this part of the world, and discussions were, where they started in some way, and we were studying a lot about this environmental issues in the university, in the classrooms, but I didn't find a lot of the information in public space and media. So I went to a radio station and I told them I can, work as a science or environmental programmer or journalist, and they thought that my voice is good enough to broadcast, and that's where I started working more on, communications or journalism. And then the more I did, I found that this space has not been occupied by many people like me who understand this in a different way and have been studying about it. So I wanted to create some space and tell the stories that I was studying in the university, and that led to me, working for the newspaper, and partly for the BBC's radio in Nepal and for other international outlets. And currently I am working with the global network for environment journalists called Earth Journalism Network as South Asia coordinator. So yeah, that's how I ended up being a journalist.
Yeah, and maybe Ramesh, tell us about the hour, the minutes when you realized this new catastrophe was unfolding.
I was just having coffee in the morning, and I was about to start my day, and the news started to emerge saying there's a huge flood. Then everything, because the point from where this flood started, I have spent a few nights. I have been there a few times. I went there at least 3 times in last 10 years, to do a story. Twice I was there to understand where this China-Nepal railway is coming, and I was in the ground. I was talking to people. I was talking to politicians. I had a photographer friend who was with me, and I did a story. And then last time in 2018, I was there to start a journey, 2,000 kilometers journey from Tibet to India, with the expedition team that wanted to enter from Rasua, where this exact event happened, and then go to Tibet, then travel 1,000 kilometers northwest in the Mount Kailas region, and then follow the longest river of Nepal that originates in southwest Tibet. So we walked for 25 days. We rafted for 9 days. We went to India. So all these memories that I spent on that Nepal-China border came up one by one, and I started to think like, okay, what had happened there, and I started to follow everything from there. So it had, I had a lot of memories of people, the landscape, the infrastructure that was in place. So everything came up around that time.
Yeah. Dan, let's zoom in on this particular event. I want to get back to the one that you did the paper on in Science, and the general issues and policy questions, but let's just get right into what happened and where. So here's a pretty good Al Jazeera map of the region. Maybe just talk through a little bit
Sure.
what's understood so far.
Yeah, I haven't actually seen this yet. That's a nice visualization. So I first heard of the event from a text from a colleague yesterday, and saw some of the videos and started hunting around on satellite imagery to see what the source might be. The videos, I hadn't seen the Chinese border station video yet, that horrific one, or the one of the buses, which are just so much more dramatic than the others. But the other videos of just a tremendous amount of water in the rivers. And so, I knew, okay, we've got to be searching for, probably some source of water, very possibly something related to, something gravitational, like a big landslide. And so just sort of looking around, and eventually some of the satellite imagery started coming in, and I was led to this valley here, Langtang-Lirung. And unfortunately, the initial satellite imagery was a little bit cloudy, but we could just barely see that part of the glacier, right where that orange square is, had basically vanished. It was gone. And initially, I thought maybe this was some sort of digital artifact, because the break in the glacier was straight, almost like a knife had cut it, which just seemed kind of odd. But I was, convinced myself that was real. And so there, at the time, what I could sort of deduce was that part of the glacier had broken off, dropped something like a kilometer, not quite vertically, but at a pretty steep slope, and then would have disintegrated, and then formed this debris flow that would have moved down the valley, and then taken this sharp left into the Lendekola. Tremendous relief in that image there. Several thousand meters of elevation change from the lowest point up to the highest point. And one of the things that is tough to think about, because this is such a horrible tragedy that is, we won't know the full extent of for quite some time. But on the other side of that mountain is where Langtang village was, which was completely obliterated in the Gorkha earthquake 11 years ago. So just a horrifically sad hotspot for this kind of event.
Yeah, boy. It's a region where there's so much in play. I didn't actually have you walk through the idea of the dynamics of the Himalayas, particularly compared to the Rockies or any other mountain range on the planet. Let's get into the geology a little bit, and then we'll get back to the thing that we all, at least some of us initially were focused on, the thing that we already knew about, the glacial lake outburst, and why this isn't that. But just so how much does it matter that the Himalayas are essentially a newborn mountain range?
I don't think that plays a big role here. Okay. I suspect if you asked 5 geologists, you're going to get 6 answers to that question. I think the bigger issue is the geology itself. So what are the specific structures in the rock? Planes of weakness, that sort of thing. What the glaciers have been doing, et cetera, more so than how young they are. Mountains that are uplifting quickly, whether tectonically or by what we call isostatic rebound. So, after glaciers disappear, the ground kind of bounces back. So Southeast Alaska has got the highest rebound in the world. These mountains that are rising quickly tend to erode faster. But I personally, I don't think that's a huge factor here. But as most scientists, I'm happy to be shown that I'm wrong in this case.
Certainly, the steepness of the valleys and the lake just give you that amplification of the flooding, which we saw in horrific detail. In so many of these images. Here's just one. That was the same thing on a smaller scale that we saw with Hurricane Helene hitting Asheville, North Carolina. Communities really tightly packed along these rivers and steep-sided areas create that kind of vulnerability part.
And I think that's one of the big challenges in mountain environments, is that there really are not flat places to live, to grow, food. People tend to build on alluvial fans because those are the flat areas, but of course those are also where where debris flows come down, and not exactly the same as in this case, but this happens time and time again.
Yeah. Hold on, I'm just going to take that off. It's still mind-blowingly mesmerizing and horrific.
It's hard to watch. I can't imagine, Ramesh, how hard this must be for you to be watching.
Yeah, it's so hard. There are people, my friends who started with me, they are out of contact. A couple of them, I saw some posts of their wives sending some messages saying, "Can you find them?" There are people who have lost everybody around. It is, and then I have traveled this region so many times. I have the memories of all these places and people around. So it's really, really hard.
Yeah, and still unfolding. I mean, the water flowed, but the search and rescue is just getting into gear. And I remember when I covered the Nepal earthquake. I wasn't in Nepal, but at that time, Facebook was becoming a place where people would post, "Hey, our village is cut off. We need a helicopter." And social media. I mean, social media has a problematic role in these events too, because you don't know what's real anymore.
Yeah.
I showed that video, and I'd have to really triple check if that was authentic.
I saw some today on Blue Sky that were very obviously not the right site, and I commented on them, and it was taken down.
Well, that's
by the original poster, not by moderation service.
Yeah, and then you see, just to kind of get at this issue again, which I think is the information environment is polluted and hazardous now, and that creates big problems. I just want to show another example where now you may say this is actually a really good illustration. You've probably seen this already. This is one of these AI generated quick deconstructions of what happened, and it feels to me, well, I don't know, is that sort of at least a good conceptual summary of the idea, or is it? How do you deal with this now?
Yeah, I could nitpick about the beginning, which is essentially a snow avalanche, and the going into all these lakes, and
right.
I mean, generally speaking, yeah, stuff came down from very high to much lower, exploding as it did, releasing just unbelievable amounts of seismic energy,
Right.
and traveling very, very far downstream. I haven't actually traced how far downstream yet, but some of my colleagues have been looking at that, and I don't know, I think it's like 1,000 kilometers or something. Not the landslide, but the sort of the turbidity in the river. I don't know. I'm not a big fan of generative AI, generally speaking.
Yeah.
But or I shouldn't say generally speaking at all. Point. Period.
I think it's more. It has generalized a lot in that video. The real picture is much more complex. It does not do the way it has pictured. It has oversimplified, I think. Dan, one question that people haven't really answered was like, when this snout collapsed, or the glacier collapsed, was there an inundation for some time?
Like a lake that was formed?
Yeah. No, nope. I mean, that was one question that I, because if there was inundation, then people lower stream would have noticed this drastic, lowering down, or the flow of the river would have changed dramatically, right?
Yeah.
So that nobody reported that as something they saw.
No, that would certainly have been a completely reasonable guess of why, like where all this water could have come from. If you dam the river, landslide comes down but stops, you dam the river, form a big lake, and then that bursts 6 hours later. And we looked for that, or my colleagues and I. So we found no evidence of a lake, but also evidence of no lake. So, from the satellite imagery, we can see. Now, of course, the satellite imagery is from several hours after the event itself, and so if a lake had existed for 2 hours, we wouldn't see the lake itself, but we would likely have seen some evidence of water having ponded. And didn't see anything like that, but also, and perhaps more smoking gun, so to speak, is that the seismic data from the seismometers indicated that this mass flow, this landslide, was a continuous event. So in other words, it didn't descend, stop, and then get released hours later. It was one continuous event. And so, I would say essentially zero chance that any substantial impoundment occurred. With that being said, there is one right now. So in the debris, right at where, and Andy, on that map that you showed, the Al Jazeera one, where that takes the turn to the left, in the debris right there is a pond which has, so let's see, where would that be? More or less where it goes into the main trunk valley there. There is a lake that has formed. As well, there are lakes, there is one, so if you go up to where it says glacial collapse, and then there are like these orange arrows, probably down by about the second arrow, there is a lake that has formed up there. And so these are concerning because if those should then burst, which they will eventually, that could impact any ongoing rescue efforts downstream. And so I haven't seen any, but I would be surprised if the Nepali army hasn't flown up there and assessed and tried to figure out whether to try draining it or whatever. That was certainly the case in Chamoli. There was a big lake that got formed that was artificially lowered.
So one of the things that came up, and I don't know, Ramesh, if you've heard in the early hours, some Indian politicians, I think they were from India, not Nepal, were talking about the lack of cross-border communication, that China, in Tibet is not exactly in resilient, cooperative communication with its neighbors. Is there any indication you've heard that that's part of why there might not have been more warning? Although, boy, again, the abruptness here seems to be such that it would be hard to see if any warning would have been sufficient.
Yeah, I think when that rumor started to brew up and people started to pick it up, Chinese embassy in Nepal had issued clarification that it's a fake news. We did not do anything intentionally, and there are people on their side who have been killed, who have been missing right now. So there isn't any reason not to share information if they had, and there's no evidence which says that they use the information to save themselves, not us, right? So I think it is not something that that was real. I think they didn't know, and they didn't know that it was going to happen for sure. But it is, in general, it is very hard to communicate with the Chinese authority, Chinese government. They have their own way of communications, which we don't understand in many ways. And I think language-wise, I think the broader level of communication was lacking. At people-to-people communication wasn't there. There was no communication with the media as such, from that side. And in general, I think they were communicating with the authorities in Nepal, and they had to translate that information to us. Yes, it is not that easy to communicate with them, but I think the the issue that they didn't share the information wasn't real. But one thing is very important to tell is like this is not an event that has happened as a standalone event, right? In
Right.
last 10 years, we have seen this kind of events across Nepal-China border, and there hasn't been a communication system that has been developed by the countries. And I don't see like China has invested a lot of their resources, because they are capable, they have capacity, they have resources. They could have deployed a reliable early warning systems in the region, which I don't see adequate, and they could have done it in better way. I think there's that this is a larger issue than the issue of whether they share the information or not.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And just to reinforce, Ramesh has been doing reporting on this for years. Here's a piece from 2020. Himalayas will see a dramatic rise in landslides by the end of the century. Maybe getting back to you, Dan, on that, the geological reality. Climate's a lot. We haven't talked about climate change yet, and so maybe let's get into that in terms of how that plays. A lot of people jump to conclusions on both ends. How do you cut through all that?
Yeah. I mean, when we're talking about climate change impacts in mountain environments, like high mountain environments, not the Appalachians, we're thinking about, I would say, three main things, and maybe there's some others that I'm not really thinking about, but we're thinking about glacier thinning and glacier retreat. We're thinking about permafrost thaw, permafrost degradation, and we're thinking about changes in magnitude, the amount and the timing of precipitation, and how that is impacted by changing air temperature. So, we could talk about each one of those. Many of us in the geohazard science community who work on these glacial environments, we resort to, or we we use glacier debuttressing as kind of a not an excuse exactly, but sort of a factor in explaining these events. So the idea being that, as the glaciers are eroding the valleys and making those valley walls steeper, when the glaciers then retreat or thin, they remove that support for the valley walls, and then they collapse because they're simply too steep. And that I'm certainly convinced that that does play a role. How much of a role, I don't know, and there hasn't been. I don't think there's been sufficient research on sort of exactly what's happening in the stress states within the rock, and so that I think that'll be an avenue of more intense research in the coming years. Another big one is permafrost. We think of glaciers because we can see them, but permafrost is supremely important in these very high mountain environments. And if the permafrost is maybe we should explain what permafrost is. Essentially permanently frozen ground. So ground that remains below 0 degrees Celsius for 2 years or more. And the idea is that, or how it's relevant here, is that if there is any water in the ground, in the mountain slope, and you have permafrost, that water will remain frozen, right? If that ground is very close to the limit of permafrost, so the air temperatures that the permafrost can no longer exist. If it's right around that threshold, then that water will sometimes be ice and sometimes be liquid and sometimes be ice and sometimes be liquid. And that sort of cement that holds it all together is losing all of its strength. As water freezes, it expands, and then when it melts, it contracts. And so any cracks in the mountainside just get progressively bigger and bigger. In this particular case, yesterday, that probably wasn't a factor. The elevation that the landslide initiated from was probably about 1 kilometer or maybe a little bit higher than the permafrost limit. But in many other cases, it does seem to be a factor. And then lastly, precipitation and temperature. If we have more intense rainstorms, or we have maybe more precipitation in winter, but perhaps air temperatures are just high enough that it falls as rain instead of snow, this sort of thing, we change how much water can get into glaciers, underneath glaciers, into cracks in the bedrock, etc. And so whether that played a role in this event yesterday, we will try to figure that out. But certainly, and it may be the story that you're sharing here, shallower landslides, debris, smaller debris flows, where water can saturate the soil, the uppermost, few meters of soil, and then that can give way. That's certainly where climate change, I think, will completely change how material moves from high places to low places.
These are all really important points. And one thing that's unnerving in what you're describing is the complexity is such that it feels like it would be hard to think of predictive factors or ways that you could, unlike with a glacial lake, which is rising and you can see dynamics. You're describing dynamics that might be hard to forecast.
Yeah. I was in Norway last week, and they have, Norway is a country with lots of topography and, not as many glaciers as Nepal, but they've got some, and, they have a lot of my computer's going to restart. Hold on. Let me say not now. There we go. I think it wants to do an update, which I've been avoiding for who knows how long. Norway has a lot of very, very big landslides, not just historically, but prehistorically as well. And it's really trying to restart. Hold on.
Oh boy. Oh, Ramesh, over to you. It must be midnight in look at that, it's noon here. I bet it's oh boy. Well, anyway, he'll come back if he can.
But I think that's a very important thing. Like, I feel like, climate, Glacier Lake is the tiger in wildlife, right? In wildlife, like there are so many other wildlives, they deserve more attention. But the dominant character is tiger or the rhino or this big animals. On climate change, I feel like when you talk about mountain environment, the space that glacial lake takes, and people don't talk more about the changes that is happening, like permafrost, the importance of that in destabilizing the mountain environment or the slopes, or those kind of things are not discussed to the extent they should have discussed, right? Even in media, we talk more about gloves. And the researchers are more into glacial lakes because it is easier to show to the people, and maybe the funding thing where you can say, look, this is evidence, like the lake has increased by this one. So that is a dominant character on climate, actually. And I have seen that throughout my reporting, career in last 15 years. That's something we need to talk more about, and the importance of that in destabilizing the slopes or the mountain environment is quite important.
I'm showing a paper that seems to capture the complexity. One thing we do in the media all the time is, one thing is we latch on to the new thing. And for those paying attention to high mountains and climate, glacial lake outburst floods were a thing. And so we have a habit of immediately assuming that's the thing. And then the complexity emerges. So this has been true in my reporting on many other aspects of that broad concept of climate change. So I guess it's important to talk to scientists, for example, who can reveal that complexity, and it's still, but for people in the way, this is where the role of journalism is so important. What you're doing there, particularly, and also what you're doing on Substack now, the fact that you do it in multiple languages is a way to connect not just people like me with the ideas, but those who are right there in the Himalayas or in downstream. So talk a bit about. Let's just get back to your journalism, and I wanted to kind of make sure people know about what you're doing on Substack. Hold on, I got to get that link back. I had you here. Substack. Hold on. What do you see as the best way in a complicated media landscape to have people really kind of get the real information, including the uncertainties that they need to?
Yeah. So in today morning, I was I was so confused what I need to do. I don't really work with the media outlet every day. And in the morning, I just woke up and said, I'll do a video telling people what science has been telling of that incident. So I focused that 8-9 minutes of Nepali video, telling like what are the things that people are telling, for example, what is the real cause. And a lot of people were appreciating. They wanted to, have clarification on things that this information ecosystem is so big, it is so intense, it is so confusing, and people are really trying to understand what is actually happening. So I did that video, and then it has got a lot of attention. I shared that 2020 story about the glacial lakes I mapped based on a story from AC Mode, and it has also got a lot of attention. So glacial lakes has that charisma of attracting people, because I think the events that we have reported in the past many years are more glacial lake outburst floods, and those incidents happen quite a lot. That is in the memory of people. So they always think climate change means that one, but as Dan was saying, the dynamics of the permafrost, the becoming water and again ice, and water and again ice, and the destabilizing the slope, the interchange that happens. So I think at this point of time, people have so much of information, but they are not able to really segregate that information and then, and then validate that information for their consumption. Right. That's
right.
I find that that's the biggest struggle people are having right now, and there's a chunk of there's a mass that always tries to tries to make this kind of events political. For example, China didn't share. For example, when there's a flood in Nepal, media in UP or Bihar in northeastern India, northern India, they start saying, "Oh yeah, Nepal flooded India," and this kind of blaming start, the upper riparian and lower riparian kind of thing. But as a journalist, also it is really hard to communicate these kind of things because you need to have a solid understanding of what is happening before you tell to the audience, right? And even scientists are also divided on many things. So yeah, it's a very complicated and complex ecosystem, and it's not easy to really distill that information for your consumption and for the people who you communicate, right? So it's a very complicated information ecosystem that is around us right now.
Yeah. So Dan has rejoined us after his computer reboot.
Sorry about that.
And we were talking about again the sort of the how do you get the right information to the right people at the right time to try to reduce the risk being mostly a function here of exposure and vulnerability, the hazards there. I don't know if you have your own theory of change or theory of impact.
Yeah, I was responded to somebody on social media earlier today about who was saying something like, don't worry about posting more. The science can can wait, or something like that. And my view, I guess, is in these rapidly evolving situations where I and many of my colleagues have pretty specific subject matter expertise, I feel it's our duty to provide information in whatever way we can. If that means we have links to journalists or to politicians in Nepal in this case, great. Otherwise, on social media, and especially if you are kind of a trusted authority on those topics, then hopefully that information will be the information that that gets kind of repeated.
Well, and both of you, just in our conversations here, have indicated that you have been sought out by, whether it's Anderson Cooper or the New York Times, by being public figures in a time of confusion and catastrophe, demonstrating your ability to curate, at the very least, the flow that people are ingesting. You're potentially influencing these larger platforms as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes work, of course, as Dan knows. In academia, you're still not really rewarded for the time and energy you put into that. Daniel Swain here in the United States has been great on wildfire risk, but he's complained publicly and actively about, how do I make a living with that part of my life? And so there are interesting questions all around there.
Yeah, at least from the academic side of the world, many faculty members or government scientists, I suppose, are a little bit different because sometimes they're handcuffed and not allowed to speak. But as faculty members, we have incredible privilege and freedom to be able to talk, to whomever about our, the work that we do. And many faculty are hesitant to do that, and I understand why. But I think that just puts more onus on those of us that are comfortable doing that to do it, all the more. And whether we get sort of recompensed for it or not, I don't really care. I get paid my salary, and that's fine.
Yeah, I know that feeling.
And
I'm
there are some
semi-retired.
people I feel like there are some academic people who are overexcited also. I was watching a couple of interviews saying, "Oh, I don't care, but it is a glacier lake outburst flood." There's so immense information out there in public that is still arguing that this is a glacier lake outburst flood, and it's also something I've been seeing now is that there are people who are trying to get more attention and creating something that is not validated, and it is okay for somebody to say that, but as a geologist, as a geomorphologist, as a scientist, it's you should be very, very sure to claim something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even I see some attempt or kind of a tendency to grab that attention and claim something much earlier than the event. Much earlier, and then try to create some confusions that has. I saw that also in several events that I have reported.
Yeah. Well, this, Dan, you may have dealt with this already. One issue, journalists migrate through their call list and they tend to go with the more dramatic response. So even if a person isn't the most expert on something, if by the way, think about COVID, this is not limited to geophysics.
Yeah.
The media tend to migrate to the hottest voices, and just so if you're nuanced, you'll end up in the cutting room floor.
I've found certainly with science journalists, obviously the smaller outlets can't afford to have a science beat, but the bigger outlets where people focus on environmental reporting or climate change or science, I've had almost nothing but good experiences. where they want to get it right. They want to tell it in a way that's appropriate for the audience, but they want to get the science right, and they want to develop a relationship so that they can come back, so that I'm in their Rolodex and vice versa.
Exactly.
And when somebody writes a story that is obviously, sort of scientifically wildly inaccurate or inflammatory or breaks an embargo or something like that, they then won't be trusted by the rest of the scientific community. And so I think that's probably a short-lived career. But, certainly we saw that with COVID, absolutely.
Now, now that you're back, I'm glad you were able to deal with the computer issue, because I do want to go back to 2021 and 2022. And for those who might see this as a unique event, I think that is a helpful place. I'm just going to show here briefly. It's a little dizzying to show a previous show. This is the one in 2021 with Ramesh and a couple of scientists from Colombia and elsewhere talking about this horrific event in a different region in India that wiped out 2 dams, killed workers in the dams, and also I think initially a lot of confusion about the cause.
Almost identical to this event yesterday. Initially there was a lot of scientists who were saying this was a glacial lake outburst flood from even naming a particular mountain that it had come from. And I was convinced that that was not the case, because I didn't see any evidence whatsoever in the satellite imagery. And this event, as it turned out, almost exactly the same kind of event as we saw yesterday, although a very different scale. This one in Chamoli was horrific, but this one yesterday in Nepal is beyond. It defies belief
in terms of the human impacts.
Yeah.
Just so we know, geophysically, are they comparable, or was there even seismic record for the earlier one?
Yeah, there was. I don't remember the volumes, and of course, we don't know the volumes of this one yesterday. But it's likely to be extremely large. So maybe on the order of 200 to 300 million cubic meters, which is, amongst the biggest landslides that we'll have experienced in recent history. Whereas the Chamoli one was 70 million, maybe. It's probably in the abstract there, or maybe the intro paragraph. 27 million. Okay, so this one is probably something like 10 times bigger.
Wow.
In terms of the initial volume, and then how much it bulked up as it went downstream. We don't know yet, but we'll know that in the coming days.
Wow, that's astounding. There's one graphic in this paper that you led back then that I think is instructive just for right here.
Mm-hmm.
I assume you and or others will be doing a deconstruct of this event, but this let me just go back to it here. Hold on a second.
Mm-hmm.
Right here. Does this pretty well describe conceptually what you think has unfolded? Obviously at much more massive scale.
The geometry is different, but probably similar. So one of the differences here was that like in Chamoli was that the chunk of rock that basically popped out of the mountainside was almost entirely covered by this hanging glacier. In Nepal yesterday, the bit of glacier that was that collapsed with the landslide was only covering a little bit of the rock. That doesn't really matter except for the science, but a similar idea. Yes, the rock, huge chunk of the mountainside came down with some glacier ice on top. And one of the interesting things that it looks like in yesterday's event was at the bottom of the valley where I guess this direction, where the landslide impacted, it looks like there was some old glacier ice in that bottom of the, sitting in the valley, just sort of wasting away. And so that may have contributed a substantial fraction of the water, the liquid water that we see in those flood videos. That with Chamoli here as well, that's where the water came from is the big, the really hard thing to figure out. Well,
wait, with the new one,
what to do about it. But scientifically, the hard thing to figure out was where the water came from.
Are you when you say that, you're talking about the new one?
Yeah. So it looks like there's some old ice in the bottom of the valley the day before the event.
Yeah, here's another graphic that someone has produced. Oh, maybe it was Grok. Someone had posted this on LinkedIn.
Oh, yes, I see the graphic.
Does that kind of resonate as fairly?
Well, I mean, the angles are completely wrong, but
okay.
26th of August, 2026.
Sorry.
Angles are totally, yeah. No.
Okay. Yeah, so beware, Grok. As always. There's so much more to go over. I think maybe we should, seeing as you're in Copenhagen and in Nepal and it's late, maybe we can revisit these questions and just out of respect for the people who are still just grasping the human losses. I've dealt with this. I did a piece on the Venezuelan earthquake. There's always this tension as a journalist, and when is the right time to do the analysis when things are still unfolding, especially for Ramesh and his networks. This is a live unfolding catastrophe where people are still missing, and the human impact will play out for a long time to come, sadly. So let's call it a day. And I thank you both, Dan Shugar, University of Calgary, Ramesh Bhushal, great journalist, focused on the Himalayas. Do check out his Substack. Himalaya Speaks, I think, is the link.
Himalayaspeaks.com. Yeah.
Himalayaspeaks.com. I'm going to put that in the chat here for those who. Himalayaspeaks.com. And let's reconnect on these questions. Obviously, I've done 3 or 4 shows on these questions already. It's a running thread, and making the world safer in these regions is a huge challenge. By the way, we just for earthquakes, not let alone this kind of a dynamic. This is Andy Revkin. This is Sustain What. You can reach me with show ideas or feedback using that scrolling bar at the bottom. And again, thanks to my guests. Onward.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Dan.
Hold on one second.